this audio, I'm going to talk about the difference between confidence and self-esteem. I often hear people talk about confidence and self-esteem in the same sentence. They get lumped together, but they're actually very, very different. They're not the same. Now, that doesn't mean that people who have good self-esteem won't be confident, or indeed that people who are very confident won't also have good self-esteem. But it's not necessarily always the case. It's actually very possible for someone to be incredibly confident and yet have very low self-esteem. In fact, sometimes when someone's extremely confident, no one realizes how low their self-esteem actually is. It's well hidden. It's also possible for someone to have very good self-esteem and yet lacking confidence. And this is usually in specific areas of their lives. Now, both confidence and self-esteem have a massive impact on the daily quality of our lives. They impact on the way that we engage with life and the way that we tackle the ups and downs of everyday living. So I'm going to talk about how to identify the differences between them, and then I'm going to also talk about what we can do if we recognise that we have a problem in either area. A good way to think about the difference between self-esteem and confidence is that self-esteem is an internal experience and confidence is an external experience. Let me explain what I mean. Self-esteem relates to the way that we feel about ourselves. It's a reflection of our own inner sense of self-value and our own inner sense of entitlement. So it's an internal relationship. Whereas confidence is a reflection of the way that we experience ourselves in our external world, in our relationships with other people and with situations and with circumstances. In fact, confidence can be very specific. We can feel confident in some situations and yet not in others. We might feel very confident in a particular working relationship and yet not confident in closer, more intimate encounters. Or we might feel very confident within certain social settings and yet not at all in others. We might be a very confident basketball player and yet have no confidence at all as a footballer. So confidence is something that can be very specific, and it's also something that we can learn, like a skill. And the more that we do it, the more our confidence will grow. So for example, if I lack confidence in my ability to cook, I could go and do a course, and I could learn to overcome my difficulties in this area of my life. However, self-esteem is the way that we feel about ourselves. So even if I became a very competent and confident cook, if my self-esteem is low, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would ever feel really good about the fact that I'd learned this skill, even if I became incredibly good at it. I might never really acknowledge my achievement or place any value on it. I might always feel that I could have done better or that the meal wasn't really up to scratch. So even if we become confident in any particular area of life, the way that we actually feel about ourselves could still be at an all-time low. Many years ago, I watched a television program called Child of Our Times. It was a TV series that took a study group of children and every year filmed them at different developmental stages. It was actually a fantastic series, and I highly recommend it. In one particular episode, they conducted 2 different experiments to measure confidence and self-esteem. Now, as I remember it, in the experiment for confidence, each child was initially sitting and playing with one of their parents, with another adult present in the room. When the parent then left the room, the child's confidence was measured depending on their ability to interact with this other adult. Now, most of the children demonstrated a certain amount of reticence and shyness, but they were still able to interact with the other adult. But 2 of the children particularly stood out. One because she was so incredibly confident. She spoke really eloquently with the other adult and was very much at ease. And the other because he was so shy. He was at the opposite end of the spectrum, and he absolutely refused to engage with the other adult at all. In fact, I think he hid under the table. It was interesting, though, that this little boy's father had also suffered from immense shyness as a young person, and he recognised that his son was very like himself. But he had no concerns at all about this, because in his own adult life, He'd gone out and taken classes and had coaching in order to build his confidence and overcome his shyness. So he'd learned the skills that he needed in the areas of his life that were important to him. And in fact, he'd become a very successful man out in the world. Now, when it came to the experiment about self-esteem, each of the children were given a jigsaw puzzle to complete. It was one of those wooden jigsaw puzzles where the pieces slot into the right shape space. Now, one of the pieces had been altered so that it wouldn't fit. And this means the children couldn't actually complete the task, and they had to effectively keep on trying. After a set amount of time, the children were then distracted, and the correct piece of the jigsaw puzzle was swapped with the misshapen piece, so they could then complete the task. Every single child was given an identical amount of time, and when they completed the puzzle, they were given a sheet of gold stars, and they were asked to award themselves the number of stars that they believed they deserved for completing the task. Most of the children were somewhere in the middle range of the number of stars that they awarded themselves. But two particular children stood out. One child because she didn't give herself any gold stars at all, and one little boy because he was the only child who gave himself the whole sheet. The little girl didn't award herself any stars because it had taken her so long. She felt that she'd failed and she was rubbish at it, so no gold stars. The little boy who awarded himself all of the gold stars and gave himself the whole sheet said, "I was really good. It took me ages and ages, but I did it in the end." So we can see in this wonderful example that confidence and self-esteem are very different. And in the self-esteem task, each child had the same jigsaw, an identical task in an identical time. And all of the children actually approached the task with confidence. It was well within their range of capability. And yet one child feels rubbish about herself and awards herself nothing. And another child feels fantastic about himself and gives himself all the rewards that are available to him. Tons of gold stars, tons of self-esteem. 0 stars, 0 self-esteem. Our self-esteem is the way that we feel about ourselves, regardless of the actual situation and regardless of the outcome. I think this is one of the most fantastic examples of measuring self-esteem and confidence that I've ever come across. Not only because it helps us to clearly define the difference between them, but also because it can begin to help us to understand the way that we build confidence and the way that we build self-esteem and the relationship that exists between them. If we work on the premise that knowledge is power, then the more that we understand and know about something, the more opportunity we have to address any difficulties or issues that we might have. So let's clarify for a moment. Confidence is the way that we feel about interacting and engaging with something external, whether it's talking and relating to others or doing something in our world. And self-esteem is the way that we feel about ourselves. It's about our own inner sense of self-value, regardless of the external circumstances that are taking place. If we lack confidence in any area of our life, but our self-esteem is good, it will act as a kind of a buffer or a solid foundation. We'll feel more resilient. We'll feel more able to try something and, regardless of the outcome, still feel good about ourselves. We can have a go, fall over, get back up again, and still feel good that we tried. But if we have bags of confidence but very low self-esteem, then regardless of a successful outcome, we very rarely feel good about our achievements. People who have very low self-esteem are almost always incredibly critical of themselves. They have a raging inner critic, and they continually put themselves down. And even when they achieve something really quite significant, they never reward themselves. They never allow themselves to digest or own or celebrate the good experiences that they generate and create in their lives. And not only do they not reward themselves, but they often don't receive compliments easily either. And this will actually perpetuate low self-esteem. Our self-esteem and our self-value grows through true regard and respectful acknowledgement and recognition. Just think about the way that children respond to positive feedback. If achievement is never recognised and celebrated, then the feel-good factor will be missing. Even if a child is encouraged to have a go and confidence is built, if the outcome isn't validated, then the experience won't be internally consolidated. So we can recognise that confidence can be learned and is very specific. We don't actually need to feel confident about everything, and that's okay. However, low self-esteem can cause much greater difficulty in our lives. In fact, if we lack confidence, then very low self-esteem can actually inhibit us from feeling able to go out and learn the skills that we need to overcome this. In fact, people with low self-esteem sometimes actively sabotage any attempts to build confidence. If you recognise that your confidence is low, then it's important to feel okay about this and go and find the appropriate help and support in any area of your life that's needed. If you recognise that your self-esteem is low, you may find there are some deeper emotional underlying issues causing the problem, and it's important to feel okay about seeking help and support with this as well. If you do have low self-esteem, here are 2 really useful exercises that you might find helpful. Most people with low self-esteem have a notoriously active inner critic, and yet frequently these kinds of people can be incredibly supportive and respectful of others, and yet don't offer themselves the same level of support and regard. So if you find yourself becoming very critical of yourself, then firstly, try to develop an ability to press a pause button. If your inner critic is used to being in charge, then that will be a kind of a default position that you slide into easily. So developing a pause button may take a few practice runs. The key here is that if you find yourself slipping into a critical place, it's really important to not then criticise yourself for being critical. Loads of people do this when they're trying to move away from a strong inner critic in their minds. So start to learn to press the pause button and be supportive of your learning process. So you've pressed the pause button. Now notice what you would have said to yourself. Imagine that critical voice, but observe it rather than be in it. Stand back and notice. What would your critical response have been to yourself? And now imagine the impact of saying that to a child. For many people, the things that they say to themselves would reduce a child to a place of absolute distress and despair within minutes. And yet, bizarrely, we often do this to ourselves all of the time. And for some people, it's not just critical, it's a real internal put down. Now imagine that you're listening to someone else, someone you care about. They're in the same situation as you are. They're vulnerable and they need your support. Perhaps it's a close friend or maybe a child. Now, what would you say to them? It's interesting that the kind of things that we would say to someone else are very often a million miles away from the kind of things we might say to ourselves. It's really important that we learn to give ourselves the same level of support that we would offer others. This is a really good exercise to begin to notice and make changes to the way that we relate to ourselves. Start to talk to yourself as you would to someone you care about or to a child. So that's the first exercise. Here's the second. Remember that people with low self-esteem very rarely reward themselves and very rarely validate their achievements. Go and buy a notebook and some sheets of gold stars. I want you to begin to notice your daily achievements and make a note of them. Begin to connect the things that you do actually achieve and the things that you're doing well, however small, as well as however large. Especially if there are some areas of your life where you're working at making changes or doing something differently. It doesn't matter how small something is, I want you to validate it, recognize it and validate it. If you're working on exercise number 1, then validate and acknowledge yourself when you begin to notice your inner critic. And validate and acknowledge yourself if you manage to press the pause button. These are achievements. Particularly if your inner critic is a kind of default position that you slide into easily. As your day progresses, award yourself gold stars. Or if that's not practical, then do it at the end of the day. But have fun with it. Some people get their families and even their children to join in. We can validate ourselves and we can validate each other. This can really turn a corner in a family home, especially if we've all got stuck in a rut where there's far too much criticism and not enough recognition and acknowledgement, celebration and validation. If you find that you're reluctant to validate yourself, then look a little deeper. Why is this? What's going on? And if you were talking to a close friend or a child, would you be acknowledging and validating them? Validation is crucial to growth and self-value. It's very, very important that we start to offer ourselves the validation and the recognition that we need. If you're feeling isolated or alone, or if your self-esteem is really low, then allowing yourself to consider seeking help also deserves validation and recognition. If you've logged onto this site and you're listening to this talk, that also deserves validation and recognition. Human beings are wonderfully complex, and learning to understand ourselves emotionally is absolutely at the core of our health and well-being in every area of our lives. I'm going to finish this audio with the 7 golden rules of self-esteem. In fact, write them down or print them out. Number 1, learn to listen to yourself. Number 2, turn off your inner critic. Number 3, become reflective rather than reactive. Number 4, be kind to yourself. Number 5, have a go and reward yourself for doing so, regardless of the outcome. Number 6, be supportive of your learning process. And number 7, validate your achievements, however small you may think they are. Thank you for listening and take care. This is copyrighted material 2014. Jenny Burgess, The A to Z of Emotional Health.